Welcome to episode 5 in my restorative gardening series, and in today's video I'm going to be teaching you how to grow bush beans. Now, if this is the first video that you're joining us for, my name is Jordan. I founded a company called Mind and Soil with the hope and intention of introducing 1 million individuals to gardening's mental health benefits. So not only do I want to be helping you grow beautiful vegetables and flowers and herbs, but also to help you do so in a way that brings you peacefulness and joy and restoration. And so I encourage you to actually also explore back through the videos that I've done in this series, because I touch on topics such as how to prep your garden for the upcoming season, how to go about starting seeds for the season ahead, how to prepare your soil so that your plants have everything that they need to thrive, as well as video growing guides such as how to be growing broccoli or cucumbers, potatoes. So I really do encourage you to spend a couple of minutes exploring the rest of the videos in this series. And with that being said, today I'm going to be entirely focused on showing you how to grow bush beans. And this is such a fun and cool crop to have in your garden because it kind of sits as a little bit of a ground cover throughout your garden, but it also yields beautiful and delicious beans for you to be enjoying either fresh or in meals or potentially even pickled. So I really love this crop, and the way that I'm going to break this video down is into 7 steps for growing bush beans. And the very first step is timing. And so bush beans can grow in a cooler temperature where the nighttime low is around 8 Celsius or 45 Fahrenheit. So we can get them started and transplanted into our garden a little bit earlier on in the season. However, we do still want to be patient until it is at least 8 Celsius or 45 Fahrenheit as the average nighttime low. And that's for 2 reasons. The first is that it's going to help us get a really nice and high germination rate. See, for seeds to germinate and begin growing into whichever plant, they need moisture and they need warmth. And so if we start them too early on in the season, well then ultimately we're not going to have that much success because it's just gonna be too cold for those seeds to be germinating. And secondly, by waiting until those temperatures are warm, ultimately it's going to allow the plant to grow way more vigorously than earlier on in the season when it's really frigid and the plant is just trying to survive for dear life. So being a little bit patient on that front is ultimately going to reward you with really beautiful harvests of beans throughout the season. So for myself, I'm located in zone 7B, and the average nighttime low of about 8 Celsius, 45 Fahrenheit, that usually happens around the beginning of May. So it's around May 1st that I start all of my bean seeds for the season ahead. Now with that being said, step 2 is to start your beans in seed cells. And you might be wondering, why am I starting them in seed cells rather than just direct sown into the garden? And in my personal experience, which I can only speak for myself on this one, but I've found that peas and beans are kind of the most susceptible crops to being picked at or eaten away by different critters throughout the garden, be it birds, slugs, anything else. Something just about these 2 crops that as soon as they poke through the surface, it's a very appetizing meal for some of those critters throughout the garden. However, once they're a couple of weeks older, say 2 to 3 weeks in, it seems like they don't get attacked nearly as often. So for myself, I simply start them in seed cells in a more protected environment, and then after about 2 to 3 weeks, I then transplant them into the garden where they're then going to be able to continue to grow without being attacked by some of those different critters throughout the garden. And so for starting these seeds in seed cells, the first thing I do is grab a 50 seed cell tray and I begin filling up each of the plugs with worm casting seedling mix. And as I do that, with beans, I am okay starting them in these smaller plugs. Most of the time I prefer 3-inch seed cells, but for beans, since I'm only gonna have them in there for about 14 days, I'm okay with starting them in a smaller environment. Now, after I've filled up each of the seed cells, I'm gonna give each row 1 turkey baste of water. And I'm doing this because I want to begin moistening the seedling mix. After I've done that, I'm then going to place 1 bean seed into each one of the seed cells. So simply go ahead and place 1 bean seed into each one one of those seed cells. And after you've placed them into the seed cell, you're then going to give them a second round of watering, 1 turkey base of water per row. And that's again ensuring that's a nice and moist environment. After that, simply cover them with about 0.5 centimeter to 1 centimeter worth of seedling mix and give that final layer of seedling mix also a turkey base of water. So this ensures that the seeds have everything that they need in order to germinate and begin growing. Now these seeds do have the moisture that they need to germinate and begin growing, but the last thing that they need is warmth. And this is where we kind of have two options. So if it is starting to get nice and warm outside where you live, then you could start these seeds outside. For seeds to germinate and begin growing, they'll generally start germinating at a temperature of about 70 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius. And so if you're getting into that range outside, absolutely feel free to start them outside. I very frequently will actually do them in a little bit of a DIY greenhouse environment so that once again, none of those pests or critters throughout the garden can be getting to them. But if it is a little bit earlier for you and you don't quite have the warmth that you would be liking to see for them to be germinating, then what you can do is simply place that tray underneath your grow lights and allow them to start growing indoors. This is going to ensure that you get a really nice and high germination rate, and then very early on in their life, we can simply bring them outside and transplant them into the garden. So for them to germinate, again, we need them to be in a nice and warm environment. Now on the moisture front, through the germination process, we want to ensure that the seedling mix is moist at all times. And so to check if your seedling mix is still moist, all that you need to do is place the back of your hand on the top of the seedling mix. If you're not feeling any moisture on there whatsoever and it's really kind of starting to seem like it's dry, then it's at that time that you want to give them their next round of watering. We want to ensure that that top layer of seedling mix where the seed is planted is ultimately staying moist at all times until the seed has germinated and started to grow. So keep a really close eye on this. Simply place the back of your hand on it, kind of every day or every few days to ensure that it is moist at all times, and you'll be rewarded by getting a really high germination rate. And so over the course of the next 10 to 14 days, as your bean seeds are germinating and beginning to grow, this is the perfect time and opportunity for us to move on to step number 3, which is preparing the soil. And now the good news about bush beans is that they don't require a ton of sun for growing. And so you can find an area in your garden that gets about 4 to 6 hours of sunlight and choose this as the spot that you're ultimately going to be planting your bush beans into. And that kind of also allows you to then save some of the sunnier areas in your garden for those sun-loving crops such as tomatoes, cucumbers, etc. And now if that location is either in a raised bed in your garden, or if you're going to be growing them in a container, then the soil blend that I love to go with is 75% compost and 25% vermiculite. And it's really easy to create this blend. All that you're going to need to do is simply grab 3 parts compost, 1 part vermiculite, blend those two together until consistent, and then add them into either the raised bed or the container that you're growing in. On the other hand, if you're going to be growing bush beans in the ground, then the mixture that I like to go with is 50% compost and 50% native soil. And so to create this blend, all that you need to do is go to the area that you're planning to plant and ultimately turn into your in-ground garden and put down 6 inches of compost. Now, once you've put down those 6 inches of compost, you're going to grab a rototiller and you're going to rototill this compost into the top 6 inches of native soil. So now we're blending 6 inches of compost with 6 inches of native soil. And that's what's ultimately going to create that 50% compost, 50% native soil blend. And as you're doing this, you're going to have to be pushing pretty hard on that rototiller to get down to the depth that you want to be at. But doing so is ultimately going to save you literally years and years of the compost doing that on its own. So putting in a little bit more effort right now to really establish that soil and that ecosystem is going to fast track the growing success that you have with that particular area. And the last thing you might be wondering is, what if I already have soil in the area that I'm planning to plant my bush beans into? Well, in that particular instance, it's really straightforward, really easy. all that you need to do is add 1 to 2 inches of compost onto the top of that area and then simply leave it there. You don't need to till it in, anything along those lines. We just want to get into the process of beginning to add compost into our garden beds as a means of making a deposit of nutrients and microbial life into the soil. And I really encourage you to begin getting into the process of adding 1 to 2 inches of compost to all parts of your garden each season, as that's kind of like a deposit that we're making of nutrients and microbial life that's ultimately going to allow each crop that we plant into that soil to really thrive. So make sure that you're adding nice amounts of compost into your garden. And so with the soil now all prepped, we are all set and ready to move on to step number 4, which is transplanting. And so for bush beans, we don't want to leave them in their seed cells for really more than about 14 days, because once these seeds germinate and begin growing, every single day those roots are going to grow a ton, and very quickly they will become root bound if we were to leave them in those small seed cells. So to begin transplanting them, the first consideration is spacing. And on this front, I encourage you to plant either 2 or 4 bush beans per square foot. This past season, I did 2 per square foot. This past season, I actually only planted 2 per square foot. And as the season went on, I felt like I could probably fit 2 more into each one of those square feet. So don't be afraid to plant these nice and densely at up to 4 bush beans per square foot. Now, once you've determined your spacing and where the transplant holes are going to be, the next thing is to actually dig these transplant holes, and you're going to go about 3 to 4 inches deep on each one of the transplant holes. And then once the hole is dug, you're then going to add about half a handful of worm castings and half a tablespoon of 444 organic fertilizer. Gently work that into each one of the transplant holes, and then grab your bean seedlings and then pop it into the transplant hole that you just prepared, backfill it with the surrounding soil, and then give it a nice and big drink of water to help it settle into its new home. And so by transplanting it like that, it has all of the nutrients, all of the microbes that it needs to absolutely be thriving this season. And that brings us into step number 5, which is watering. And on this front, the biggest recommendation that I can make to you is to set up a DIY automatic irrigation system. I've got a whole video on how to go about doing this, and I really encourage you to check that out. It might seem a little bit daunting or a little bit overwhelming at first, but believe me, it is super easy to set up. And then once you have it set up, it's not only going to save you literally hours every few days of hand watering that you would have to be doing otherwise, but it's also going to allow you to ensure that you're getting the absolute best and most optimal amount of water into the root zone for each of the different plants that you have all throughout your garden. So setting up a DIY irrigation system, absolutely one of the best decisions that you can be making. Now, once you do have the initial pieces of it put in place, all that you need to do is run one of the watering spikes to where you have planted your bush beans. And personally, I like to put 1 watering spike per square foot. So 1 watering spike for each of the 4 bush bean plants in that square foot. And then I run it at a really low water pressure. And I do that for 20 minutes every 2 days. The reason why I run it at a really nice and low water pressure is because that ensures that all of the water is working its way down into the soil rather than spraying every which direction. This ends up being a really efficient way to go about watering. Now, if setting up a DIY irrigation system isn't an option for you, then you're going to want to go down the path of hand watering. And it's really straightforward on this front as well. All that you need to do is grab your hose and go over to the plants that you're going to be watering, such as the bush beans, and then simply turn the hose on and begin watering the plant right at the soil level. We want as much of that water making it down to the soil as possible, and continue watering this area until the water begins to pool. Now, as the water begins to pool, you're going to move on to the next part of your garden that you need to be watering and start watering that area. What's happening now for the bush beans is that all of that water that's pooling up there, it's slowly working its way down into the soil. And so you go about continuing to water all the other parts of your garden, and once you've finished that, come back to the bush beans, double check to make sure there's no longer any water water pooling. And assuming that's the case, you now do a second round of watering. So once again, water the bush beans and do so until the water begins to pool, and then move along to the next part of your garden, doing a full 2 rounds on everything that you need to be watering that particular day. This approach of doing 2 rounds of watering is going to ensure that tons and tons of that water is actually making its way down into the soil rather than just running off to the sides, and that's going to provide the nice and deep watering that our plants need in order to be thriving all throughout the season. So we've now got the watering taken care of, and one of the best parts about bush beans is that there's nothing else that we need to be doing. There's no pruning that we need to be doing. Since they're bush beans, they're going to stay nice and short, so there's no trellising that we need to be doing. All that we have to do is just let them grow over the course of the season. And as we do that, they're going to put on foliage growth, and then after the foliage growth, they're going to start putting out flowers. And that brings us to step number 6, which is harvesting. And on this front, you might be wondering, when do I know that it's time to harvest my beans? And so as the plant grows, it's going to begin putting out flowers. And these flowers, once pollinated, are ultimately going to be developing into the beans that we are looking to be harvesting. And so as you see them begin to grow, you're going to notice that they're starting to get closer and closer to looking like a nice and mature bean that you would see at a market or a grocery store. And as they approach that size, the best thing to do is simply to pop 1 or 2 of them off of the vine, give it a taste, and see if it's feeling like it's ready to be harvested. There isn't an exact day or moment that is right to be harvesting bush beans, but once they're in that size of being similar to what you'd find at a market or a grocery store, it's a great time to begin sampling them and seeing if they're ready to be harvesting and enjoying. And so at that time, simply go ahead and begin harvesting a whole bunch of them off the plant that are looking like they're mature. It's likely that there will be some that are not quite yet ready to be harvested, so simply leave those ones on the plant to continue growing and enjoy those at a later point in time. And then once you have harvested them, you could either enjoy them fresh right then and there, you could boil them or steam them and have them in a dinner. You could potentially even go about pickling them, which is one of my favorite ways to be enjoying beans. So with the harvest now complete, you're probably wondering, well, how is there another step? What should we be doing after we've harvested the plant that we were looking to be growing? And for step number 7, it is the second harvest. And so once you have harvested all of the beans off of your plant, it's still going to be growing and there and full of foliage. And the plant is now going to be thinking, oh, we don't have any more beans that we're putting energy towards developing. Well, in that case, we better do more foliage growth, and then ultimately we should put out more flowers. And when the plant does that, those flowers are going to get pollinated, and that's ultimately going to result in a second round of beans for you to be harvesting and enjoying. So after you do your first or your main harvest of your bush beans, what I encourage you to do is leave that plant in the ground, because what you're going to notice is that new flowers are going to emerge on that plant that are then going to turn into beans for you to be enjoying even a little bit later on in the season. So that is the second harvest that you get to be enjoying. And that's everything that you need to know in order to begin growing bush beans really, really successfully. The only other piece that you might be wondering is, what's the variety of bush beans that I've been showing in this video, and what are a few of my favorite varieties? So the variety that I have been showing you in this video is the Gold Rush variety of bush beans. And I absolutely love this variety. I find it to be super high yielding. The beans themselves are absolutely delicious. So I really encourage you to try that one out. And then the second variety that I really enjoy growing for just kind of your classic green bush bean is the Ferrari bush bean variety. And that's another one that is just a very high yielding, very easy to grow bush bean that is a great complement to have in your garden, as again, almost a little bit of a ground cover that is just kind of covering some area, and then you pull over one of the leaves and you've got a whole pile of bush beans to be enjoying. So you now have everything that you need in order to be successfully growing bush beans this season. Really encourage you to try out each of the different steps that I've outlined here today. And if you do so, I know that you're gonna have an absolutely amazing crop of bush beans. That's everything that I wanted to cover off on in this lesson. Can't wait to catch you on the next one. And until then, go get those hands dirty. See you then.